Hello, and welcome to the No Hair and All Heart podcast. I am your host, Mookie Spitz, and I am the bald guy with no hair. And my guest today is All Heart. She is Carol Goodfriend, and she has an amazing story to tell about caregiving, late life decision making, and empowering individuals with their own healthcare decisions. Welcome, Carol. Thank you for making time today.
Hi, Mookie. Thank you for having me, and thank you for allowing me to tell my story.
It is my absolute pleasure. Today, we're going to talk about medical assistance in dying. The acronym is MAID, MAID. Listeners might have heard about this, but we're going to dive in from a very, very personal perspective. So, Carol, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? And we'll roll right into the story of being a caregiver and decision maker for your mom.
Great, thanks. So I am living in Philadelphia. My mother lived in South Jersey, and I lived a couple hours away from my mom for several years. And I moved down to Philadelphia when my mom was 80, and it was really nice to be close to her and to spend more time with her. Life changes brought us closer together geographically, and it was really great. We got to spend a lot of time together. My mom was very vibrant. She was active. She was a regular spinner. She took spin classes a couple times a week. She worked out with a personal trainer. She played cards. She had played mahjong, and she traveled to Florida for a couple of months in the winter for the last few years. And she was very active and a happy person.
How
She was 83 when she passed recently. She lost her husband, my dad. They were married for over 50 years, um, and they had a long and happy marriage. And he passed away in 2021 during the lockdown COVID period. He didn't pass away from COVID, but he did pass away at that time. And it was shortly thereafter that I had moved down to Philadelphia to be closer to mom and for other life changes. So we were very close, and she was a very active person. And
and
recently,
how was her overall health? So she's 83 years old. She's a widower, but she's coping. She's managing. You came down to Philly to be close to her, so she had a loving daughter nearby. Does she have grandkids and the whole family as a support structure as well?
oh, absolutely. One grandchild living in New Orleans who's now 25, and a granddaughter who lives in Philadelphia with her fiance at the time, they're now married. Lots of love, great family support, lots of friends, very social person, and a very active person, and 100% competent mentally, and just an all around really fun, great person. My mom and I were very close. Although I want to say about a year ago at this point, she started slowing down, but inexplicably, because for example, she'd be in spin classes, but then she would walk somewhere and she would be winded just existing. And we couldn't figure out what was going on. And it started a whole series of doctor's appointments and trying to figure out what was wrong with my mom, because she could be on a spin bike, but yet just existing was causing her to have breathing difficulties. And she was checked out by pulmonology people and cardiology, and she was having other issues as well that seemed to come from out of nowhere, and nothing was understood or explained. She was having trouble with her throat, losing her voice, um, a lot of coughing, and we were having a hard time putting together the puzzle pieces of her suddenly strange health issues that were unrelated, and couldn't figure out what was going on with her.
So this is every daughter and mom's worst nightmare, which pretty much happened quickly, it sounds like. So you have an 83-year-old woman sound mind and body, active, engaged, healthy by any stretch of the imagination, and then fairly rapidly. How long ago was this first sign of deterioration in her condition?
Well, we're really not exactly sure, but I will say a year from now. So a year from so we're in February now, and so I would say February 2024 is when it really started to seem like something is going on and we couldn't figure it out. It might have been earlier than that, but we weren't necessarily aware of anything.
Okay, so she starts picking up these debilitating physical symptoms. You go to doctors, specialists, trying to figure out what it is. And when did you arrive? When did everyone arrive at a definitive diagnosis?
Well, that's an interesting question because the official diagnosis didn't come until September of 24. But honestly, there were a lot of different other things going on, problems with her back, her knee. She had already had one knee replaced. She was hoping to have another one possibly done. She wanted to feel well enough to attend Rachel and Andrew's wedding in September and to be able to dance and have a good time. And instead, she continued to deteriorate, and we couldn't figure out what was going on with her. Mentally, she continued to be fine, but she was having problems with her voice, with coughing, her ability to move, breathing issues. And I was having coffee with a neighbor of mine who lives in my apartment building in Philadelphia. And I was lamenting my concerns about my mom's physical health. And my neighbor has a husband who's lived with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, for 10 years now. And my neighbor said, you might want to get her checked out just to find out if it's ALS. And that was May, June. And so from that time forward, I started trying to steer my mom towards physicians like a neurologist, which my mother said, "What do I need a neurologist for? I'm fine." I really did not want to use the words ALS in front of my mother, but eventually I was able to steer my mom in that direction by seeing some of her other doctors and throwing some words out at them that they knew that she didn't, and eventually got her in front of the right people. And eventually she was diagnosed with ALS.
So that shows you how tricky some of this can be. Many people operate, I think, off the tacit assumption of the miracle of medicine, and diagnostics like this can be complex, and it's also coupled with the resistance on the part of your mom, right?
And also the fact that people don't think of ALS as impacting somebody who's 83 years old. Typically, now it was explained to me that ALS occurs on a bell curve in terms of age. And also, if grandma, let's say, is starting to slow down and having trouble with her motor skills, well, grandma's aging. Or somebody, a senior, is losing their voice. Well, that happens quite often. And so, taken separately, all of these symptoms might just be seen as aging. But because it was happening to somebody who was so vital and physically active, it didn't seem right. And because I was able to finally get my mom in front of the right kinds of physicians. The other thing that's really important to know about ALS is that it's a diagnosis by elimination. It's not a diagnosis where you can simply take a test and say, yes, that's ALS. So lots of other things had to be ruled out, including things like Lyme disease and other neurological stuff.
So it sounds like a very complex health situation eventually got reduced into a simple yet tragic diagnosis.
Yes. Yes. I mean, ALS does not have a good outcome. It's just a matter of time. ALS is terminal. And for your listeners, most of your listeners probably have heard of ALS and know that there's no cure and it's degenerative, and people lose their ability to walk, to talk. They lose all their physical autonomy and generally remain fully cognizant of everything that's happening to them. And the typical lifespan of somebody with ALS is 2 to 5 years from diagnosis.
Yes, I think most folks are familiar with the Ice Bucket Challenge, which was the advocacy effort for raising awareness for ALS. There were millions of videos online a few years ago. And Stephen Hawking, the astrophysicist in the wheelchair, is kind of an icon of ALS. And his condition was chronic and degenerative, but to the bell curve that you mentioned, he got it when he was much younger, and he managed to survive for many, many years after the signs and symptoms of the disease became manifest. So ALS does vary greatly from individual to individual. And in your mom's case, she got it late in life. There was a very, very rapid onset. And in terms of the timeline, we're looking at September of last year. Is that correct? So around September of last year, the diagnosis is official. And at this point, your mom was really suffering, right? Her quality of life had deteriorated considerably.
Yes, she was living alone in her own home, but she had a fall and really needed to be. She couldn't live alone. I had offered to move in with her. She was not interested in that, and so shortly after her actually before even her diagnosis, she had the fall, a fall, and a health concern, and she started having a full-time live-in aid in September, and she passed in November, which I know we'll get into, but it was a very short time frame from when she was formally diagnosed to when she passed.
Okay, so can you capture the mindset of your mom at this point? Clearly, she knows that she has a terminal condition. She understands that her quality of life is rapidly, almost exponentially deteriorating, and her options are very, very limited. Uh, and talk about your own mindset at this time, too. And if you can, lead us to this consideration of MAID or MAID, which is medical assistance in dying. How did it even come up as a consideration?
Good questions. Well, first of all, I always knew that my mother never wanted to be kept alive on any kind of apparatus. She never wanted a feeding tube. Not to say that it was something that we had discussed immediately with regards to her ALS, but just in general, I always knew that those things were things that she would not want to have in life. She always had a DNR, do not resuscitate order, and I always knew that she would not want the life that ALS had promised her, for the remainder of her time alive on this earth. And I'm a big believer in doing the research and learning as much as you can and making informed decisions. So, for example, once my mom was formally diagnosed with ALS, she went to Jefferson Hospital in Philadelphia, which has an ALS clinic, which is excellent. And mom really didn't want to go, and she didn't want to seek treatment for ALS. And I said, you've got to go, and you've got to go at least once. You need to see what it is, and you need to do all the research before you make any decisions. And similarly, I also knew that in some states, I didn't know the details of what states, but I knew that there was an option for choosing one's own death. And I knew that it was available to some people with some diagnoses. I didn't know what. So I started doing some research on the internet, trying to find out what the laws were in what states. And so it's the full spectrum of let's get educated about ALS. Let's see what your options are for living, and let's see what your options are for dying. And so it wasn't necessarily immediately that mom said, I don't want to live through this. It was, I mean, she was a little resistant to the thought of continuing on, but I said, listen, we've got to do all the research, we've got to get the information, and then make an informed decision. And ultimately, of course, it was her decision to choose MAID. But what we learned is that in New Jersey, you have to have a diagnosing physician and a confirming physician in New Jersey in order to take advantage of medical aid in dying, among other very specific requirements by the law. So we were concerned with her physicians in Pennsylvania. Would she be able to take advantage of this? Would she have to find new physicians? I called my mom's estate attorney, where she had made her will and so forth a couple years earlier. And the attorney did not have any specific information, but he referred us to somebody he knew was involved in medical aid in dying and advocacy for medical aid in dying. And her name is Dr. Robin Plumer. So we had an appointment with Dr. Plumer, who gave us a full education on medical aid in dying in New Jersey. And my mom immediately said, that's for me. And
All
that,
right, it can we stop for a second because that is a lot.
sure,
It sounds like you were at a crossroads. Your mom was at a crossroads. She had a choice, and it was fairly stark and binary. On the one hand, she could endure the last few months of living with ALS and all that that entailed, a loss of her bodily functions, basically, and witnessing her own complete physical deterioration because she was very cognitively aware. She had no real cognitive impairment. So she would have to endure the horrors of watching her body basically disintegrate. That was option number one. And the second option, thanks to your research, you're an amazing caregiver. You looked it up. You were inquisitive. You wanted what was best for your mom, and you're a believer in choice, in options. What else could we do? And you discovered MAID, medical aid in dying, as a viable option, and it was dependent on the legalities of the state that you live in. So she lived in New Jersey. Her doctors were in Pennsylvania. Can you give us a little more context and, if you can, a more formal description of what medical aid in dying actually is? Because I think many people come with a lot of bias and maybe they've heard some things, but what actually is it? And
sure.
how is it different from euthanasia? How is it different even from what some would consider suicide?
Those are great questions, and I would be very happy to answer that because that's really important distinctions that need to be made. So, medical aid in dying is exactly that, it's assistance in getting the medication. With medical aid in dying, a patient is able to determine when and how they're going to die, but the patient is already terminal, meaning my mom had a terminal diagnosis of ALS. You have to be mentally capable. You have to have a diagnosis or prognosis of 6 months to live, and it's essentially requesting the medication for a peaceful death. And the patient must self administer the medication, meaning my mom had to drink the medication that was to be what would send her to her final resting place and would put her to sleep, and then she would die. And it allows for a very peaceful death. The question wasn't whether my mom was going to live or die. She was going to die. She was going to die soon. We didn't know exactly when, but she got to pick the date and she got to determine how. And she was able to be surrounded by loved ones. Euthanasia is illegal in the United States. It's considered mercy killing, and it's fully illegal everywhere in the United States. Currently, there's 10 states at the time of this recording where medical aid in dying is legal. And the term medical aid in dying is used in every state where it is legal. It's the assisted suicide is not permissible. Suicide is for it's considered suicide when somebody is mentally incompetent. Generally speaking, people who choose to end their life by suicide, they're not that's not necessarily, yes, we're all going to die one day, but it's not that their death was not imminent due to a health reason. They were not expecting to die due to a medical diagnosis. Now, there are people who do choose to take their own life, who are mentally competent, who have medical diagnosis, who don't seek medical aid in dying, and that's done by themselves, and that's very unfortunate. Um, that's where people don't have an option, much like, um, if I may, where people, for example, in some states, it's legal to have an abortion, and there are other states where it's not, and where people don't have that option. Unfortunately, some people take matters into their own hands, and it's not a safe choice.
So what I'm hearing from you, just to summarize, is medical aid in dying, medical assistance in dying is not euthanasia. Euthanasia is literally when the doctor or the medical establishment takes the life of a patient. This is not what that is. It's not suicide. It's not the patient or an individual deciding to take their own life, devoid of the context of having literally only 6 months or less to live. So, medical aid or medical assistance in dying is a program that's legal in 10 states, including where your mother lived, where the patient is empowered, a patient who is terminally ill with less than 6 months to live, is empowered with the decision, if they choose, to end their own life personally and voluntarily. They administer the medication which takes their life, and they are completely cognizant and aware and able to make this decision. And it essentially empowers the individual in a way to lessen their own suffering, facing the inevitability of their own death. And they have the option as well to be surrounded by loved ones and to take their final rest in a way where they're empowered, they reduce their own suffering, and it's all legal, and it's supported by the patient, by their family, and everyone involved. Is that a decent summary?
That's a very good summary. There's still a few more things that I would add to that, that are really important for somebody who might be listening and might be considering medical aid and dying for themselves, or to share the information with a loved one. And that is, my mother did live in New Jersey, and she did have some physicians in New Jersey, not the primary ALS physicians. So it's important for New Jersey that she had two physicians in New Jersey, the confirming and the diagnosing physicians. And the other thing is, there's some very stringent requirements. My mom had to meet with the doctor who was ultimately going to write the prescription, which was Dr. Robin Plumer, and had to meet with Dr. Plumer twice, um, within a certain period of time, both to make sure that my mom understood what she was asking for, what it was, what medical aid in dying is, and that she was of sound mind and that she wasn't being coerced by anybody. And there was some paperwork that had to be signed, and the same questions occurred again about 2 weeks later. I think it's 15 or 16 days. And then once approved, the medication has to be acquired from a medication compounder pharmacy, and that's another whole process. And you don't want to have the medication in your home until you really know when you're going to choose to die, because obviously it's quite dangerous. And even once you get approved, you don't have to go through with it. So, for example, somebody could change their mind, or the day they might say, I'm not sure when I'm ready. I've made the decision, as My mother was. My mother did make the decision in October, but she didn't really have a date in mind at the time that she made the arrangements for medical aid in dying. She just knew that she had the prescription at the ready, and she didn't know when she was going to be ready. And Dr. Plumer said, when the time is right, you will know it. And as it turns out, that did occur.
So there is a very systematized, rigorous approach to instituting this request. So if the patient, their family chooses medical assistance in dying, contingent on the state where they live, there is a step by step process, thoroughly legal, thoroughly vetted, thoroughly safe, that they follow to make it happen. And this procedure could and does vary state to state. So if you're an individual who is contemplating this, either as a caregiver, as a patient, the first step, it sounds like, is A, find out if it's legal in your state, and B, inquire as to this step by step approach, which could and does vary from state to state. Is that correct?
That is correct. There's a lot of really good resources on the internet, compassionate choices, end of life choices, and in many states, both where medical aid in dying is legal and where it is not yet legal, there are advocacy groups, and you could search for that online, looking up medical aid in dying or death with dignity. Our deathwithdignity.org is a great place to start, regardless of where you are in the country, as a
We'll
place to start doing research.
Great. We'll add the links into this podcast episode into the description so people can link out to these resources that you're mentioning. In addition to and perhaps I'm rushing the story, but you, your family, and your mother were featured on a major news broadcast. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the circumstances that led up to it, and then we could talk about how you felt going through this entire process?
Sure, sure. We were connected with CBS News through an advocacy group in New York who was looking for a patient in New Jersey. Uh, CBS News was going to do a segment called Eye on America, focusing on comparing a patient in New York with a terminal illness who did not have access to medical aid in dying and compare it with a patient in New Jersey who was taking advantage of medical aid in dying, and to do a side by side comparison. What ended up airing was basically my mother's story because there was so much material and they had done such a beautiful, respectful job. Unfortunately, the New York patient was not represented in this CBS Eye On segment. It was a 2-night segment as part of the national news. However, I believe that the the producer is working on an additional piece that will include some material covering New York and the move to include medical aid in dying in other states. But they just really, really did a great job with my mom's story. Some of the highlights of that story were the time that we spent together as a family once my mom had made the choice and had picked a date. What transpired was that my mom had another fall and she broke her nose in 2 places, and she felt horrible, horribly, about how she just was not happy with how she was progressing, and that fall and the outcome of that fall is what convinced her that she had figured out that when the time was to make her choice for medical aid in dying. And CBS contacted us, and my mom, being the jokester and good-humored person that she was, she said, I'd be happy to participate as long as you're on my schedule because I'm scheduled to die on Friday. And CBS News came the day before she died, Thursday, and very quietly and respectfully, with one producer with a camera, and then the one correspondent who was with my mom for about an hour, and they spent some time in the background with our family, and they were able to see the beautiful time that we had together celebrating my mom. And in that week prior to her death, when she had made the choice, she had friends coming over, relatives coming over. People would write her a beautiful card. My mom would hold it in her hands and look them in the eye and say, "Thank you so much. This means so much to me. I will keep this for as long as I live," making jokes all the way, and her good humor making people feel more comfortable and relaxed about her choice. Um, there was singing, there was laughing, there was crying. We gathered around her chair in the living room, and then later on in the day, we all piled on top of her bed, making jokes and laughing. And we really had, strangely, a meaningful, I guess, good time. It was very difficult as her only daughter, only child, to support the decision, but yet I knew this was the right decision for her because she made it. It's what she wanted. And as I said in the story, and as I'll say to you now, the most loving thing that you can do is to support somebody in their decision. It's what she wants. That's the best way to honor and love her, is to support her decision. And while difficult, I know that it was the most loving thing that I could do.
That's amazing on so many different levels. We'll put the link to the broadcast episode in the podcast as well, so listeners can actually see the episode if they haven't already, because hundreds of thousands of people, maybe even millions, have seen it on broadcast news. So in summary, your mom literally chose the day of her passing. It was a Friday, as you mentioned. And just before she had made that decision, the CBS News folks had reached out to you. You agreed to turn it into an episode of advocacy, basically, to inform people how something like this is possible, how it happens, and actually how joyful something like this could actually be in terms of empowering a patient with a terminal illness to make that decision and do it with dignity, to do it surrounded by the people that they love. And it sounds like, empowered the family to come and visit and to, in a sense, see them off and turn what would otherwise be a horrific, debilitating, destructive 6 months of agony with an uncertain yet definitive end date. You turned it into a seeing off of your mom and a celebration of her life, is what it sounds like.
Absolutely, yes. And the other thing was, when my mom first made the decision in October to take advantage of medical aid in dying, she was very, said, "We can't tell anybody about this." Okay, I respected her wishes, whatever she wanted. But once the CBS News cameras came, all bets were off in terms of keeping it private. Um, and so, as I mentioned in the eulogy at her funeral, that was, she had decided that it was be important for other people to know that this option is available for those who want it in states where it's legal, and that not enough people knew that it was legal. In New Jersey, for example, it's only been legal since 2019, and it's fairly new, and people were very surprised. So it's been interesting educating people and sharing her story. And I feel like it's a real gift to be able to share this information with other people, in the hopes that some people will have a more gentle passing and will have the opportunity to end their life in a way that's more dignified for them if they choose to.
Yeah, as a society, we are messed up about sex. We're messed up about death. The most foundational aspects of being human get confused and become more difficult, perhaps, than they should be. When it comes to dying, there's always this halo of silence, even shame. I remember growing up back in the day, and I'm a cusp boomer, so I'm a 60-ish bald guy. But I remember growing up in the suburbs of Chicago, and if a family member were dying of cancer or if they had any chronic disease, there was this halo of secrecy and shame. And I remember growing up, you couldn't even say the word cancer.
Right?
That
Like that
that
movie where they whispered it. Do you remember that movie?
Yeah, yeah. Our entire American society has had this view of death as this, although it's inevitable, although it's a natural part of life, we shroud it in shame and silence and pain. And what it sounds like to me is this opportunity for medical aid in dying turns that on its head, which is we recognize the inevitability of death. We understand that certain people under certain conditions who know that they have a terminal illness, who know that their quality of life will exponentially deteriorate rapidly during that small frame of time that they have left, and we're empowering these people with the decision to facilitate and precipitate their own end, but to do so with dignity instead of shame. And in the most extreme way, demonstrated by your family, not to do it alone and in silence, but in a sense in front of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, not to boast about it, but basically to free oneself of the stigma of dying, and not only to embrace the inevitable, but embrace the opportunity to be empowered with the decision that's necessary at this point in their life.
Sure. Now, I would say I don't know that stigma of death would be applicable necessarily in my mom's case, but every case is different, and each family and each person's life and death and disease is different, and how they choose to view things. Um, my mother's passing would have been sad under any circumstances, but this was sad with also some joy because it was her empowerment and her choice. And the other thing that often comes up when we talk about medical aid in dying is people don't think twice when Fido or Kitty, our beloved pets, reach a certain age and they're no longer able to function and they no longer have a quality of life, and we're able to make that decision for our pets, and nobody questions it. People just know that that exists, and it exists, and if you choose that for your pet, great, and if you don't choose that for your pet, that's okay too, and it doesn't seem to be in any way controversial. Yet we treat our pets in many ways better than our family members in states where MAID is not available.
Yeah, that's the sad irony of it, where, to your point, Fido is old and Fido's quality of life is deteriorated to the point where they're suffering more than living, and we'll make that decision to free them of their pain and suffering and the inevitability of their life ending, making it easier for everyone, especially the pet. And again, going back to our societal habits and thoughts around dying, I think that there's this habit that we have as a culture to just keep folks going no matter what.
Right.
And our nursing homes, our hospitals are full of people who are just suffering. And it sounds like a process like medical assistance in dying empowers people to make that decision in a way that is dignified and compassionate.
Sure. Now, it's not available to everybody who is suffering. There are plenty of people who have chronic diseases who are suffering greatly, but they're not terminal.
Right.
And so, therefore, they must continue. And that's really, really sad and unfortunate. Um, I don't have an answer for that, or any thoughts on how to make it better, because you're always going to get into where do you draw the line, etc. But at least for some, medical aid in dying is available and is a nice option or a beautiful option for people who do qualify.
Yeah, I've been doing a little bit of research too, and what I found in terms of counter arguments, there is obviously pushback to medical aid in dying. And one of the main points that's raised is exactly what you just brought up, which is the slippery slope of it morphing into euthanasia slash suicide. That if we, the argument goes that if medical assistance in dying becomes the law of the land and it becomes more prevalent than it is, then it could be taken advantage of and it could be abused like so many things are in our society with potentially very, very damaging results. What being a caregiver who's gone through it with your mom, how would you respond to folks who feel that it has this potential for abuse and who feel that even your mom should have simply endured the trajectory of her disease like people have, and being empowered in this way might not have been the best thing for her and your family?
That's a really hard question. I can only speak for my mother's case and my mother's situation, in that honestly, they CBS asked me the same question, and it's a good question, but it's a societal question.
Okay.
I'm tongue tied and speechless about it, except to say that I'm just grateful that it was available to my mom, and that it's available to some people, and not if you don't have to agree with everything. It's well, the bodily autonomy issues of our society today, whether it's abortion or the opportunity for uh, gender affirming surgery. It's not for these things are not for everybody, but people should be able to have a choice.
I think that that's a very astute observation in the sense of just personal empowerment. There are many, many complex issues, especially in healthcare, that are riveting the nation, often dividing us. And if we look at it on an individual basis and basically empower individuals under certain prescribed circumstances to make health and wellness decisions about their lives, about their families' lives, then that is probably better for everyone. And whether it's medical assistance in dying or any of the other potentially contentious, issues, topics in healthcare, simply empowering individuals with the power of choice, with no obligation for anyone to follow suit. It's an expression of human freedom. If you don't want to participate, don't do it, but allow others within prescribed conditions to be able to make choices about their own lives.
Well stated for me and for us. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And anything else you would like to add to this conversation now that your mother has passed, and obviously you're going through the mourning period of losing her. How do you feel retrospectively about the decision to end her life this way?
I miss her terribly. I think it was the right decision for my mother, for her situation, for her life. And I'm so, so proud of how she is leaving a mark and educating others on what is possible.
Yeah, and speaking of which, again, we have the link to the episode on the news show. And can you tell us a little bit about some of the advocacy that is being done for medical assistance in dying, and even of your own efforts to spread the word, to empower others, other families, other patients with the opportunity to make this kind of decision in their lives?
Well, I knew the minute I got involved with the discussion of medical aid in dying, that this was something that I wanted to um, become an advocate for as soon as I had met some of the people involved, like my mother's physician. And once I had started doing some reading and saw that there's a whole community of people who are supporting and advocating for people to have the choice for medical aid in dying. I've been contacted by End of Life Choices New York to tell my story and my mother's story. And I think that people are very interested in a firsthand account of what it was like to support somebody like my mother in their choice. And for people who have asked, I've told them exactly how how the day went. We've discussed that. So a few people have actually reached out to me through social media who have lost their parent to medical aid in dying. And I've actually gotten involved in a support group that's mediated by some social workers about for other folks who have lost loved ones to medical aid in dying, and how we're all living with our loved ones' decisions and how we supported them and how it's impacting us. And that's been really helpful to me. And I just feel like it's been really important to connect and spread the word so that it remains legal and becomes legal in other places.
That's wonderful. And before we part, I'm sure that there's listeners to this podcast. People much like you, they're a caregiver, they're snooping around online seeking answers. What what could you tell them personally right now as they face the situation that you, your family, and your mother faced only a little while ago? What can you tell them to make them feel more assured, to guide them, and to help them along?
First of all, do your research and be a critical thinker when you're doing your research and you find information online. Consider the source of the information and know that there are options for your loved ones to have a peaceful death of their own choosing when and how they want to, if they want to, and that it can be a much more peaceful way for them to go. And you're not alone. There are a lot of support resources out there to get information both before the death of your loved one and also after the death of your loved one. Get support.
Thank you so much, Carol Goodfriend, for sharing your story, for being an advocate for personal empowerment in health, wellness, and our healthcare. And we appreciate your time and feelings and experiences.
Thank you, Mookie.